Hi, I'm Larry Castle here with Ken Brown for episode 87 of That's a Good Question. What have you been wrong about? Welcome to this episode of That's a Good Question. We started this podcast, the That's a Good Question podcast, in the first half of 2020.
Right.
Mostly as a vehicle to communicate with our congregation. We had stopped having services every week because of the pandemic restrictions. All the shutdown had just started. So we weren't meeting on Sundays, and having our blog and this podcast gave us another channel of communication when we were all separated from one another during that time. And so by the time we get halfway through this year, we will have passed our 100th episode. So it's 87 right here. And so we've talked about all kinds of topics. And as the Bible tells us, when you talk about all kinds of topics, there's a chance you're going to say something amiss. That's softening a little what the Bible says. What is it, the King James Version?
In the presence of many words, sin is not absent.
There is no lack of sin. Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of our topic for today, right?
Yeah, true. Yeah. In fact, there's a sports show on ESPN where the two hosts, they'll talk about, in a half hour, they'll talk about at least 10 topics, very fast. And then at the end, they have this short section that's devoted to errors. Okay. And they have their staff listen really carefully for anything they misspeak. And then they pass that on to the host, and then the host fests up at the end of the show.
Oh, wow. I don't know anything about sports shows, but it sounds like a good practice. We don't have a staff. In case you're wondering, we don't have a staff at the podcast. You're looking at the staff. And so it's all we can do to listen to each other and make sure we cover the topic and keep your attention. So we definitely don't have people who can get us a recounting of our errors before we're done with the podcast. Especially, we cover all kinds of topics. And so we review, and as time goes by, we may identify things. I wonder what we said about this, and we're not talking about doctrinal topics per se, though, sometimes we'll correct our thinking on that as well. We're human.
Right.
So if we find errors, then it's only right that we should take some time in one of our episodes or take an episode to talk about that. So this came about because you came to me and you said that you had recently been rethinking some things, matters about which we've spoken at some length on the podcast, and you want to make some corrections. So why don't you start off by explaining how this came about, and we can discuss whatever matters you want to correct.
Well, you know that I have been privileged for many years now to have a standing weekly lunch with some professors at my alma mater seminary, Detroit Baptist Seminary. And for about 5 years now, I have found myself at odds with not just one or two, but with all of them regarding happenings in the political realm. And our listeners know I have, and we have both really been concerned about Christians getting too close to President Trump for fear that it would hurt our testimony, because it identifies us with a kind of low character that's inconsistent with what we stand for and have stood for all of my life, going back to the Clinton days, when every pastor friend I knew said character was most important in a leader. Yeah. Clinton didn't have it, and that lack of character, in fact, was exposed in the Monica Lewinsky affair in the late 90s.
Yeah, so we've been saying, I've said a number of times in different contexts over the last couple of years, that we understand it's necessary to vote for President Trump, and that's what I've done. But we've cautioned our listeners, we've cautioned people as we talk about this, to don't be too closely identified through vocal advocacy. Social media, when you talk with your friends, when you're in conversation at church, just in the way you support, the conservative agenda we all agree on.
Exactly. In the Trump years, I saw that older position that conservative Christians had in the 90s. I saw it shift so that we were willing to overlook a lack of moral character, and I just couldn't, frankly, get on board. But I couldn't vote for Hillary Clinton. I couldn't vote for Joe Biden, but I could not be a vocal supporter of President Trump either. And so we adopted the mantra, and we've said it for the last couple of years: vote, but don't promote. That is, okay, I know I have to vote, and it's the lesser of two evils, So go ahead and vote, but be very careful in keeping your testimony in check. And that means not being a vocal supporter. Vote, but don't promote.
Yeah, we've been saying that, vote but don't promote, for really 2 years now. So how does your weekly lunch with the profs fit into this?
Well, honestly, it's bothered me for over 5 years that I have been the lone voice among people that I respect regarding the non-promotion of Trump. All the while I'm thinking to myself, there's got to be something I'm not seeing here, because these are men I deeply respect, but they are all in for Trump, and I'm not in at all. And so I naturally have to wonder whether the issue is with me and my position. And then 3 other things happened recently that caused me to do some deep reflection and soul searching. One was I ran across a story about Augustine. He's the 4th century Christian leader who, near the end of his life, he meticulously reviewed everything he had ever published. He wrote an entire catalog of his own works. It was a painstakingly annotated bibliography with hundreds of revisions and amendments to correct flaws that he saw in his own earlier material. The book was titled with a Latin word meaning Retractions. And it's powerful evidence of his humility and his zeal for
Yeah, I was going to say
being
that
truthful.
evidence is great humility.
It does, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
You know, not one of his earlier publications, in fact, escaped his more mature reflection later. And he was as bold in recanting those errors that he perceived in his own work as he had been in refuting the heresies of his theological adversaries. And so then there was a second thing. When I read the Augustine story, it reminded me of John Macarthur having to retract some doctrinal positions he had taken in the past on actually some very, very important issues. The first one was, believe it or not, on justification. In 2000, he recanted some of what he had said about justification. He wrote this. He said, "Several years ago, I made some inaccurate statements that have unfortunately confused people about where I stand on the doctrine of justification by faith. While teaching a series on this crucial issue, I made the point that God does not justify anyone whom he does not also sanctify. That is true. Unfortunately, however, I also implied that God's sanctifying work in us may in part provide the ground on which he declares us righteous. That is not true. I also suggested that God's righteousness is infused into believers in a way that makes their justification something more than a forensic declaration, and that is emphatically not true. Some of the misstatements were published in the first edition," he said, "of my Romans commentary. When I realized the error, I immediately corrected that Romans commentary."
Yeah, I recognize that phrase or the word, the term infused that he used, because that is the term Roman Catholics would use. So that's a really important one to correct.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then he, in addition to that, he had a long-running error about which he had been confronted many times on a different topic. But he held on to it for many years until finally recanting it. And that had to do with when Jesus became the Son. Has he been the Son of God for all eternity, or did he become the Son at his human birth? Macarthur taught for years that he became the Son at his birth, but that prior to that, he was not in a sonship relationship with God the Father. Now, it's important to point out that Macarthur has always believed that Christ is God and has existed from all eternity. It was a matter of when he became the Son. Has that been for all eternity, or did it happen at his birth, sometimes called his incarnation? And so that position is sometimes called incarnational sonship. Here's what he wrote in 01. He said, "I want to state publicly that I've abandoned the doctrine of incarnational sonship. Careful study and reflection have brought me to understand that Scripture does indeed present the relationship between God the Father and Christ the Son as an eternal Father-Son relationship. I no longer regard Christ's sonship as a role he assumed in his incarnation."
That's great.
Yeah.
That's the kind of humility we need when we approach God's Word and theology.
Yes.
So that's good. We've got Augustine.
Combs will come after you if you say
Dr.
Augustine.
Combs, Augustine, caught myself on that, and Macarthur. And you said there were 3 things that caused you to do some rethinking. Those are only 2. What's the third one?
I was kind of hoping you'd forget I said that there were 3.
Nope.
Because this third one gets to something I've been doing for years, and now I've been humbled about, and so I got to go public with it.
All right, my interest is piqued.
We were together earlier this week. We traveled to a seminar, and a few times during the car ride, I was going to mention this to you, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. But it actually plays a role in other bigger admission I'm going to make. So I've got to get it out there.
Confession is good for the soul.
Yes. So you and our entire congregation know how anti-dog I've been, right?
Oh, my.
Anti-dog.
Yeah.
You have more than one
I have
dog,
a whole
right?
illustration about God's grace that hinges on how much you dislike dogs. I'll share with you if I never have.
I don't think you have.
We can do an episode on that
We'll
one.
have to. Now, you have more than one dog, right?
I have 2 dogs.
I thought so. You have 2 dogs, okay? So here we are, great friends, but you have 2 dogs, okay? And when I come to your house, you're so kind as to try to corral the dogs because
not
you
very
know I'm
good
not
at it,
a
no.
dog person. But I love coming to your house enough that I do it anyway. But for some time now, my daughter Lainey and her husband Clay have had a golden retriever named Clover. And as much as I've resisted, the truth is Clover is really irresistible. She's a beautiful dog, and she's slowly, over a long time, she's won me over. Now, it doesn't mean I feel the same way about your dog or any dog that's not Clover, but as you know, but maybe I'll come around.
Can I share a quote with you? Now, I don't know that I looked up the source. I'm pretty sure I don't agree with this person about a whole lot of things, but a good friend shared a quote with me, and I really think that there's powerful truth behind it, and I see it at play here, and that is, prejudice cannot survive proximity.
That's good. That's
so,
good.
Friend listening, you know who you are. I quoted you on the podcast.
Yeah, so I have to keep coming around your 2 dogs, and then I'll let down my guard, right? Okay.
No, I think Clover's already done it, it sounds like.
Oh, well, yeah, but the Clover's unique. That's what I'm saying. So we'll have to see. Yeah, any dog that is not Clover. But as you know, I've never liked any dog, and now I like one. So, changes in the air. We'll see.
Yeah. Now that really is a surprise, and I and our congregation will pray that you get fully sanctified and like all dogs at some point, or at least those owned by members of our church.
I'll try.
Well, that's actually great progress, because most of us watching know how awesome dogs are, and we're glad you can enjoy that. So, what does that have to do with your lunch and the professors and changes? All
right, so it is really, really weird, but all of that has just conspired to make me rethink, not doctrinal issues, but as you said, of course that's possible because all of us are fallible, but some political things about which we've talked on this podcast. As I said, with the profs being on the opposite side from me for so long, it's weighed on me. And then I shifted on another pretty hard position I've taken, something relatively small, like the new dog in our family. So now I'm wondering what else I might have been overly recalcitrant, about. One final connection, and then I'll come clean. This Ukraine matter that's been in the news for a little over a month now, and that nation's President Zelensky, that has put to mind again a call that then President Trump made to Zelensky back in 2019, where you might remember they were discussing whether the U.S. would sell more Javelin missiles to Ukraine. And Trump said, quote, "I need you to do us a favor, though." And the favor was for Zelensky to announce an investigation in Ukraine of corruption into Joe Biden, which would have then tarnished Biden for the following year's presidential election. Trump was impeached for that, you may recall. But Ukraine got the missiles, even though Zelensky did not announce or even begin any investigation into Biden. So the claims of a quid pro quo, which was part of what the impeachment was about, were really hard to prove. So here's where the profs and their embrace of Trump and my extreme caution kind of all come together. Russia didn't invade Ukraine while Trump was president. So he was apparently tougher on Russia than many of us thought, that we thought he actually had some kind of cozy relationship with Putin on a basis of who knows what. But Russia didn't apparently dare invade on his watch. In fact, that claim about Russia and Trump and them being in close connection goes all the way back to the 2016 campaign. And that appears to be, in reflection, have been overhyped and resulted in the later problems that Trump experienced. If you go from most recent and then to the past, you cannot prove a connection. So I admit I can't prove this connection, but it should give more than enough to give me pause and others pause from making the kinds of dogmatic statements like I have. So Trump was impeached a second time for inciting the riot at the Capitol, remember, on January 6th of 21. But the people who did that were convinced that the election had been stolen. And part of the reason that they believed the election had been stolen goes back to 2016, because they had seen Trump pursued as he had been for several years. And so it's not at least far-fetched that this is just another attempt. The Trump-Russia connection was not as strong as I thought. And it's understandable why many believe it was used to harm a president that many people did not like. That didn't work, and yet it took over 2 years for it finally to fail. But when it did fail, then, what do you know, the following year you have an impeachment over the phone call with Zelensky. And when that failed, you have a number of irregularities, I'll say, in the election itself.
You're not saying you think the election was stolen?
I'm not.
Okay.
At least it's very far from being proven.
Right.
I've said that these irregularities do not constitute proof that the election was stolen, but I now can at least see why people think so. My friends vocally supported Trump while I vocally tried to tamp down the enthusiasm. And my attitude was kind of like that of, Athanasius back when in the 3rd century, when they're debating whether or not Christ is actually deity. And he is taking the position that Christ is God and always has been, and his main opponent was a guy named Arius, and Arius is saying that Christ has not always been God. In fact, this infamous quote from Arius is, there was a time when he was not, when Christ was not, when he didn't exist.
You're saying?
Yeah. But Athanasius then was told, hey, the whole world's against you. And he said, well, then I'm against the world. And so here my attitude was, hey, people you respect are against you. Well, I guess then I'm against these people that I respect. So,
well, and you're not saying, just to recap what you said earlier, you're not saying you changed, you've not been persuaded the election was stolen. You're saying maybe I'm too harsh on my criticism of those who think maybe it was.
Yeah, and of the evidences that don't constitute proof, but evidence. In fact, I'll mention one here in a little bit. So what I'm saying is I'm really rethinking some of my past positions on the impeachments, even the election, because, and also including the riot at the Capitol, because I can now see at least the possible connections. I've been reading the work of, and here's this thing about the evidences of the election irregularities. There's this mathematician in Ohio who's developed a compelling case about the irregularities in the election. He takes turnout data, election turnout, by age from several counties in a state. And he then averages the turnout in these counties, the percent of 18-year-olds that voted, the percent of 33-year-olds that voted, and so on. He drops that into an Excel spreadsheet. He uses its trend line tool in Excel to create what he calls a sixth-degree polynomial. It's basically a curve that's designed to fit as closely to the data points as Excel will allow. And then he compares all the other counties to that line. And amazingly, it turns out that the turnout in all the counties is pretty close to that curve. Now, that's highly, highly irregular, and it raises questions about whether there was any manipulation of the data. It doesn't answer those questions. But it should give guys like me some pause.
You're saying he sees a pattern there that shouldn't happen in randomly occurring events.
That's right. And that's what I wanted to retract today. My dogmatism about some of the claims regarding Trump and the election and the riot as they're connected. In the weeks ahead, we can bring the result of the rethinking. But in the meantime, just thank you all for your patience and for your indulgence.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your humility in saying, hey, I'm listening. I've got a strong opinion on this, but and while you may still not think that a thing is proven, it takes great humility to say, okay, so maybe it's not as closed of a case as or you're not as naive as I thought you were for thinking that.
Yeah.
That's because we together, and you've made some dogmatic statements about that. Yeah. So thank you for your humility, and rethinking this does mean we'll likely revisit some of these things in coming episodes, and as these things, some of them are ongoing as they develop more, right? Right. Okay.
Well, now this podcast airs on Saturday, every Saturday. And in this case, that would be Saturday, April the 2nd.
Yeah.
We record on Friday, which would be April the 1st, which means today is
April Fool's.
Today is actually April Fool's. And so everything I just said was all just a big April Fool's. No, really. Every piece of it was, it does make a point
Yeah.
that depending on how you believe 2015, 2016 started with Trump and the whole Russia thing, there actually is a thread that goes through there because we've noted it, in fact, in past podcasts where people are convinced that the deep state is out to get Trump. In fact, we did one on that.
Yeah.
Is the deep state out to get Trump?
That video got a lot of views. Yeah.
And that's because of that very thing, that thread that goes, look, they tried to get him with Russia, they couldn't get him with that, they're trying to get him with all this stuff, and then that leads to the stolen election. If they, whoever they are, the deep state, couldn't get him through all that, then they're going to get him by stealing the election, okay?
Yeah.
But conversely, if you believe, as I still do, that there actually was quite a Russia connection. I know there was. That's been proven. Again, read the Mueller report, okay? And if you read the Mueller report, it's just there. It's not just evidence, it's proof. And that being the case, then you didn't have people that were out to get him, that he had actually done these things.
Yeah.
And so now that changes your perspective on those subsequent things. But if you start from a different premise, then it brings you to a different conclusion.
Yeah.
So that does make an point. But let me just say now, since that was all an April Fool's thing, let me make sure everybody's clear. There is no proof the election was stolen. That Ohio math teachers thing is wrong.
When you started saying that, I thought, okay. I mean, I haven't seen this, but even the name of it, what was it called?
Giving me some. Oh yeah, the sixth degree polynomial. Yeah, sounds very impressive, doesn't it?
Well, and I repeated it afterwards, saying, "All right, let me see if I understand what you're saying." But yeah, I mean, I'm thinking this sounds like some of the conspiracy theory you would read.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And just again to make clear, Trump did in fact try to blackmail Zelensky. The only reason, I said here what his supporters say, and that is, well, they got the arms. We sold the arms to them anyway, so he didn't withhold them, so it really can't be blackmail or extortion or whichever the proper term is. But that only happened when the phone call was made public. That phone call that he made was leaked.
Yeah.
And once it was leaked that he had said that, now the weapons were released. They were sold. And Trump did allow the riot at the Capitol to continue without stopping it, when in fact he could have stopped. And it took him about, 2.5 hours, 3, I can't remember now, but it was around 3 hours. And finally, my MAGA lunch partners, who I deeply respect and still respect, they're all still wrong as well. And last, I don't love your dog, nor that of my daughter and son-in-law. Though that could change.
That's truly the saddest part about this whole joke. That is truly the saddest part. So one last question you didn't answer, though.
Oh, what?
Do you have the requisite humility to admit when you're really wrong?
This remains to be seen.
Is that a joke?
This remains to be seen because as I was writing this whole thing called Retractions, this is what are you wrong about, right? And Augustine wrote Retractions. Now I'm retracting and then retracting my retractions.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Frank Sinatra. I did it my way. Regrets. I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. So that's where we are right now. But I think I have the humility to admit I'm wrong. I just haven't done it yet.
All right. Well, that remains to be seen. There's great reason for you to keep tuning in and find out. We appreciate you all joining us for our April Fool's episode, airing a day later. And as always, make sure you subscribe to know when new episodes come out. We try to release a new one every Saturday at 2, and we'll see you in the next one. If you have a question you'd like us to consider, you can send that in to our email address, info@cbctrenton.com, or text it to us at 97000.